Welcome to the Allison Knows podcast. Today, we're going deep on a topic that's been on everyone's minds.
Power.
Yes, power. From how it shapes our world
To how we...
as individuals can actually make a difference. We've got a whole stack of books here that look at this from all different angles.
And I'm so excited to break it down with you.
Me too. I'm ready to get into it.
We've got a really fascinating mix of sources for this deep dive.
Okay, lay it on me.
We'll be looking at everything.
Ooh, everything.
Well, almost everything. We'll be looking at dictatorships to grassroots movements, and even taking a peek into the world of conspiracy theories.
All right, buckle up, everybody, because this is going to be a wild ride.
You got that right.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We've got Beyond Woke by Michael Rectenwald. We've got Dictators and Democrats by Stephen Haggard.
Making Civics Relevant by Daniel Millinson.
Operation Mindfuck by Robert Guffey.
Rigged by Molly Hemingway.
And The Color of Civics by Matthew D. Nelson. That's a lot to cover. But what I love is that we're looking at power from all these different perspectives.
Absolutely. Academic analyses of authoritarianism.
Critiques of social justice ideology.
Practical guides to civic action.
And even a deep dive into QAnon.
Exactly. We'll be touching on some really complex and sometimes controversial ideas.
Okay.
The goal here is to help you,
Yes.
the listener, understand the forces shaping the world today.
Right. And maybe even inspire you to take action. Now, I know some of you might be thinking dictatorships, conspiracy theories.
It sounds heavy.
But trust me, this deep dive is going to be anything but boring.
It's all about connecting these big ideas to your everyday life, because whether we realize it or not, these dynamics of power are at play all around us,
Right.
influencing everything from our personal relationships to the global political landscape.
I love that. So shall we jump right in? I'm particularly interested in this idea of distributive conflict transition.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that Stephen Haggard talks about in Dictators and Democrats. It sounds super complicated, but from what I gather, it basically means that when people feel like they're being systematically excluded,
Okay.
economically or socially, that's when things start to get interesting, like revolution level interesting.
You've got it. Haggard argues that these kinds of transitions are often driven by what he calls mass mobilization. Think of it like this. If enough people feel like the system isn't working for them,
Yeah.
they're going to start demanding change. And sometimes that means taking to the streets and forcing those in power to listen.
So it's not just about economic hardship, right? It's about feeling like your voice doesn't matter, like you're being ignored by the people who are supposed to represent you.
Exactly. And Haggard uses some really compelling historical examples to illustrate this.
Like what?
Think about the collapse of communist regimes in Eastern Europe. For decades, people lived under oppressive systems that denied them basic freedoms and economic opportunities.
I can't even imagine.
Eventually, that simmering discontent boiled over into mass protests that ultimately brought about the downfall of these regimes.
Wow. That's powerful. So these transitions are all about people power.
In many cases, yes. But Haggard also contrasts these distributive conflict transitions with what he calls elite-led transitions.
Okay.
In these scenarios, change comes from the top down, often through internal power struggles within the ruling class
Okay.
or pressure from external forces,
So external forces like
other countries or international organizations.
Got it.
Yeah.
So it's like a palace coup.
Or a foreign intervention.
Exactly.
Think about the wave of democratization that swept through Africa in the late 20th century. While many of these transitions were influenced by popular movements demanding change, they were also heavily shaped by pressure from Western governments and international institutions pushing for democratic reforms.
That's so interesting. It's fascinating to see how these different forces interact and ultimately shape the course of history. And I think it's really important to understand these dynamics because they're still playing out today.
Absolutely. All over the world.
Yeah, all over the world.
And that brings us to another key theme that emerges from our sources. The idea that power isn't always concentrated at the top. Sometimes it can come from unexpected places, like grassroots movements or even online communities.
Right. And sometimes those movements can be aimed at challenging the very systems that Haggard describes. This is where Michael Rectenwald's Beyond Woke comes in. He offers a different perspective on power dynamics, specifically within the context of contemporary social justice movements.
Right.
And he makes a pretty bold claim.
What's that?
That the quest for social justice can, ironically, lead to new forms of oppression.
It's a thought-provoking argument, and one that sparked a lot of debate. Rechtenwald's central critique revolves around the concept of negative egalitarianism, where the focus shifts from empowering the marginalized to taking away the privileges of those considered to be in positions of power.
Okay, so before we go any further, can we break down what negative egalitarianism actually means?
Sure.
Because I think that's a term that might not be familiar to everyone.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
In essence, negative egalitarianism is the idea that equality should be achieved not by lifting everyone up to the same level,
Okay.
but by bringing everyone down to the lowest common denominator. It's a focus on eliminating differences,
Okay.
often through forceful means, rather than celebrating diversity and individual empowerment.
So instead of focusing on, say, providing more opportunities for underrepresented groups,
Yeah.
negative egalitarianism would focus on taking away opportunities from those who are already privileged.
That's one way to think about it. And Rechtenwald argues that this kind of thinking can create a very toxic dynamic,
Okay.
where people are constantly on the lookout for offenses,
So I see.
real or perceived, and where individuals are judged and punished based on their group identity,
Okay.
rather than their actions or beliefs.
Got it. So it's like this reverse hierarchy where being the most oppressed becomes a source of social currency and moral authority.
Exactly.
And that can lead to a lot of infighting and division, even within groups that share common goals.
Exactly. And Rechtenwald doesn't shy away from exploring the historical roots of this phenomenon. He traces it back to leftist authoritarianism, drawing parallels to movements like the Cultural Revolution in China, where ideological purity and conformity were enforced through public shaming and even violence.
Wow. That's a pretty heavy comparison.
Yeah.
It really makes you think about how even movements that start with good intentions can go astray if they're not careful.
Right. It underscores the importance of critical thinking and self-awareness, both on an individual and a collective level.
Okay.
Just because a movement claims to be fighting for justice doesn't mean it's immune to the same power dynamics and pitfalls that it's trying to dismantle.
Okay, so we've got these big ideas about how power operates on a global scale,
Right.
and how those dynamics can play out even within social movements. But I'm also curious to explore how we as individuals can actually make a difference in the world.
That's a great transition. And it leads us perfectly to our next book, Making Civics Relevant, which offers a much more practical and empowering perspective on the issue of power.
I love that, because
Right.
sometimes all this talk about authoritarianism and social movements can make you feel a little helpless. Like, what can one person actually do to change things?
I think that's a sentiment a lot of people can relate to.
Absolutely.
And that's where Daniel Millinson's book comes in. He argues that we don't have to be passive bystanders in the face of injustice or systemic problems. We all have the power to identify problems in our communities
Yes.
and take action to address them.
Okay, so I'm ready to feel empowered. What does Millinson suggest we do?
He provides a really practical framework called the Advocacy Hourglass
Advocacy hourglass.
to help us understand the process of effective civic engagement.
Interesting.
It all starts with identifying a specific issue that resonates with you,
Okay.
something you see as a problem in your community that you want to address.
Got it. So let's say I'm really passionate about improving public transportation in my city.
Okay, yeah.
That's my issue. Yeah. What's next?
Then you move down the hourglass
Okay.
to pinpoint the root cause of the problem. Millinson emphasizes the importance of digging deep and asking why repeatedly
Asking why.
until you get to the heart of the matter.
So it's not enough to just say the buses are always late or there aren't enough subway lines. You have to ask why those things are happening in the first place.
Exactly. Maybe the bus routes are poorly planned,
Okay.
or the city hasn't invested enough in public transportation infrastructure. By understanding the root cause, you can start formulating a clear and achievable goal.
So in the case of public transportation, my goal might be to advocate for increased funding for new bus lines or to push for a more equitable fare system.
Precisely.
Okay.
And once you have that goal in mind, the Advocacy Hourglass guides you through the process of identifying your targets.
Hold on. By targets, you don't mean like people to attack.
No, not at all. Think of targets as the individuals or institutions who have the power to make the changes you're seeking.
Gotcha.
In the case of public transportation, your targets might be city council members,
Right.
the mayor's office, or even the State Department of Transportation.
Makes sense. So I've got my issue,
Yes.
my root cause,
Yes.
my goal,
Yes.
and my targets.
Yeah.
Now what?
Now it's time to choose your tactics. Millinson walks you through a range of tactics.
Oh, tactics. I like it.
From direct lobbying and
Yeah.
public awareness campaigns to community organizing and coalition building.
Got it.
Yeah.
So if my goal is to get more funding for public transportation, I might try to meet with my local city council member and present them with my research and my proposed solutions. Or I could organize a rally to raise awareness about the issue and put pressure on elected officials to take action.
Exactly. And Millinson emphasizes the importance of tailoring your tactics to your specific goal, your target audience, and the resources you have available. There's no one-size-fits-all approach to civic engagement.
I love that Millinson gives such practical advice.
Mm.
It really does make civic engagement feel more accessible and less intimidating.
He also provides a ton of concrete examples and case studies of how individuals and groups have successfully used these tactics to create change. It's a really empowering resource.
I'm so glad we included this book in our deep dive. It's a great reminder that we all have the power to make a difference, even if it's just in our own little corner of the world.
Speaking of making a difference,
Yes.
Do you want to take a moment to remind our listeners how they can support this show?
Of course. If you're enjoying this deep dive, please take a second to like, subscribe, and share this episode with your friends and family. You can also join me on YouTube at Allison Knows, where I post even more amazing content. Now let's get back to our discussion about power. We've talked about dictatorships, social movements, and civic engagement. But there's another facet of power that we haven't touched on yet, and it's a bit of a dark one.
The world of conspiracy theories.
Conspiracy theories, huh?
Conspiracy theories are a fascinating and often unsettling aspect of how power and belief intersect. They can be incredibly seductive.
Oh, yeah.
Offering simple explanations for complex events and tapping into our primal fears and anxieties.
And in today's world where we're constantly bombarded with information from all sides, it can be really hard to discern what's true and what's not. It's like, how do you even know who to trust anymore?
That's a key question, and it's something that Robert Guffey tackles head-on in Operation Mindfuck.
Oh, okay.
He delves into the world of conspiracy theories, specifically focusing on the rise of QAnon, and he argues that these narratives are often deliberately crafted to manipulate people's beliefs, and so distrust in established institutions.
Okay, so for those who might not be familiar with QAnon, can you give us a little background?
Sure.
What is it and why has it become so influential?
QAnon is a really unique phenomenon. It's like this sprawling, ever-evolving conspiracy theory that blends elements of traditional right-wing paranoia about a deep state with a distinctly modern, almost gamified approach to spreading its message.
Gamified. What do you mean by that?
It all started with these cryptic messages posted online by someone claiming to be a high-level government official with Q-level security clearance.
Wow.
These messages, known as Q-drops, were filled with coded language and allusions to obscure historical events.
Okay.
And they invited followers to decipher the hidden meaning and connect the dots.
So it's like a giant puzzle.
Yeah.
And people get sucked in because they feel like they're part of this exclusive group. That's in the know about something that the rest of the world is oblivious to.
Exactly. It taps into this very human desire to feel like you're privy to secret knowledge that you're seeing through the matrix, so to speak.
A matrix. Yeah.
And the internet provides the perfect platform for this kind of narrative to spread because it allows for anonymity, rapid dissemination of information, and the creation of these echo chambers where people can reinforce each other's beliefs without ever being challenged.
And that brings us to Rigged, right?
Yes.
Molly Hemingway takes a closer look at the impact of these conspiracy theories on our political landscape.
Right.
And she argues that they're not just harmless fun, but can actually pose a real threat to democracy.
Hemingway makes a compelling case that belief in these theories can erode trust in institutions, fuel political polarization, and even lead to violence. She points to the January 6th insurrection as a stark example of how these online narratives can spill over into the real world with devastating consequences.
That's a really sobering thought. It's easy to dismiss conspiracy theories as the fringe beliefs of a small group of people.
Right.
But when those beliefs start motivating real-world actions, that's when things get really scary.
And it's important to remember that these narratives are often targeted at people who are already feeling marginalized, disenfranchised, or distrustful of authority.
Right.
They offer simple explanations for complex problems, often scapegoating specific groups or individuals, and they can create a sense of community and belonging for people who feel isolated or unheard.
So it's not just about the content of the conspiracy theory itself, but also about the underlying social and psychological factors that make people susceptible to these kinds of beliefs.
Precisely. And that's why it's so important to address these underlying issues. We need to create a society where people feel like they have a voice,
Okay.
where they can trust institutions to be fair and just, and where they have access to accurate information
Yes.
and the critical thinking skills to discern fact from fiction.
That makes so much sense, because if people feel like they're being ignored or lied to, they're much more likely to turn to these alternative explanations, even if those explanations are based on floozy evidence or outright falsehoods.
And that's where education comes in. It plays a vital role in equipping people with the tools they need to navigate this increasingly complex and information-saturated world.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about education.
Okay.
We've got one more book to discuss, and it's called The Color of Civics by Matthew D. Nelson. This book really dives into the importance of teaching students about power, politics, and social change in a way that's both engaging and empowering.
Nelson makes a compelling case that traditional civics education often falls short because it focuses too narrowly on the mechanics of government and not enough on the lived experiences of people, especially those who have been historically marginalized or excluded from the political process.
So it's not just about memorizing the branches of government or how a bill becomes a law. It's about understanding how these systems actually impact people's lives and empowering students to become active participants in shaping those systems.
Exactly. Nelson argues that by exposing students to a wider range of historical narratives and perspectives, we can help them develop a more critical understanding of power dynamics and a greater sense of agency in their ability to create change.
I love that, because so often civics education can feel really dry and abstract, like something that's happening in a textbook or a far-off government building, rather than something that's directly relevant to their lives.
Right. And Nelson's book is full of really inspiring examples of how educators are bringing civics to life for their students. He talks about teachers who are using simulations and role-playing to help students understand different political systems, who are incorporating local history and current events into their lessons, and who are encouraging students to engage in community service and advocacy projects.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
It really shows how education can be a powerful tool for social change. Not just for transmitting knowledge, but for fostering critical thinking, empathy, and a sense of civic responsibility.
Absolutely. And I think one of the key takeaways from Nelson's book is that civics education shouldn't be confined to the classroom. It needs to be integrated into all aspects of a student's life, from their families and communities to the media they consume and the online spaces they inhabit.
That's so true, because we're constantly being bombarded with messages about power, politics, and social change, whether we're scrolling through social media, watching the news, or even just talking to our friends and family.
And it's crucial that young people have the tools to critically analyze those messages, to identify bias and misinformation, and to form their own informed opinions.
This has been such a thought-provoking discussion. We've covered so much ground, from the dynamics of authoritarian regimes to the power of grassroots movements,
to the seductive allure of conspiracy theories,
and the transformative potential of education. It's really made me think about how power operates on so many different levels, from the global to the personal, and how we all have a role to play in shaping the world around us.
I completely agree, and I think it's fitting that we end this deep dive with a call to action.
Love that. What are we calling our listeners to do?
We're calling on you to think critically, to engage in meaningful conversations, to get involved in your communities, and to be the change you want to see in the world.
That's a powerful message. And it's a great reminder that even though the world can sometimes feel overwhelming, we all have the power to make a difference.
Absolutely. And if you're feeling inspired to take action, we encourage you to check out the resources mentioned in this episode. You can find links to all the books we discussed in the show notes.
And before we wrap up, I just want to remind everyone that you can support this podcast by liking, subscribing, and sharing this episode with your friends and family. You can also join me on YouTube at Allison Knows, where I post even more amazing content.
And don't forget to follow Allison on Blue Sky.
Yes.
Like, subscribe, and share your comments to allisonknows.bsky.social.
Thank you all so much for listening.